Welcome to part 2 of the Innovation by Design Project-Based Learning Workshop number 2, Developing a Project-Based Learning Framework. In this one, we're going to start with where we left off the first lecture, which is a map, a workflow map, in which we can start to understand the overall process for how one might be able to construct a project-based learning course. In it, as we discussed on the left, is all the things that happen before the course, ways of creating the essential elements of the course, understanding the purpose and the dedication of the course, and who's going to participate in it and how. And that from there, different trajectories are encouraged to happen based on your project teams and the participation. So whereas you start with the same theme, they all can branch out. Through the process of discovery, ideation, experimentation, and evolution, we go through higher order thinking skills of understanding, applying, analyze, evaluate, create. Eventually, we get to the final public presentation. From that final public presentation, we find that although there was one way of starting the project under a particular theme or heading or guiding question, we find that there's lots of different potential solutions. And these potential solutions all point to a general common purpose. From there, we know that these projects can evolve either into further classwork, research, careers, or even community engagement. So how do we actually start put this framework together? In lecture 1, we talked about ways of doing it with the discovery process and different prompts in the discovery process and general teaching tactics. I'm going to back up and go a bit towards the planning side of it. If you're trying to establish even the framework for the whole class, obviously there's things that we need to understand right off the bat. How many students? What year? What majors are they? But the other thing I wanted to mention is you really have to think about whether or not these students are going to need training in PBL activities or training in how to work together as teams. Oftentimes in the courses I teach, the students have had plenty of experience working in teams, but honestly, they've never been taught how to work in teams. And so, in fact, you can see some of the body language in which the person behind is a little bit frustrated because she's not able to participate in the overall discussion. Now this happens, and it's also something that you can do to actually be able to teach students the right way of both interacting with each other and the right way of participating in a project-based learning class. So my hint is this: build in class time to do it. Talk about the project-based learning. Show them a diagram like this. Explain the different phases of work. Explain that they'll have to go back and forth between this work. Why? This helps with the metacognitive aspect of the course. When they ask, well, why are we doing this? You'll be able to say, this is why we're doing this. This is why you'll be able to recall more. This is why actually this process will help you complete the work. If you remember from lecture 1, what we're trying to get at is an intrinsic motivation. Way of saying, I understand why I'm doing this work. I understand the challenge of the work. I understand the benefits of the work. And when they're able to situate themselves within it and motivate themselves to do the work, great things happen. Now, this is also something that we talked briefly about in lecture number 1, which has to do with the changing roles of both faculty and students in project-based learning. We'd mentioned that oftentimes in project-based learning, there's an interdisciplinary quality to it. And sometimes the interdisciplinary quality breaks down some of the silos that so frequently happen within academia. But there's also a teacher-centric approach that frequently occurs, in which the teacher is the holder of the knowledge and the teacher then distributes the knowledge to students. So instead of just being a source or a dispenser of the information, or the teacher is the sole authority and expert in the work, in the project-based learning, you want to be comfortable moving towards being a designer of learning experiences. One of the reasons I continue to show some of the teaching tactics is so that these teaching tactics can be incorporated in your work. When the topics, in fact, expand beyond your discipline, as we had mentioned in the previous lecture, you have to learn to become a coach or a facilitator. Yeah, I don't know about that topic either. How are you going to go about exploring this? And when you're a coach or a facilitator, you learn alongside the student. And there's this bonding that happens about the learning process in which you're both able to see how that work evolves and give hints about how to make the most of it. So you then as an instructor become a reliable expert on the process. Students then enjoy this because, of course, they move away from just listening or watching, or their dependence on someone else to feed them knowledge, that they feel like they're gaining knowledge and not necessarily experience. And they move towards people who are able to create and discover knowledge. They have an autonomy. Remember, student voice and choice and authenticity are essential elements to all project-based learning. With that, they find themselves also, when they're given the opportunity to do these higher order thinking, that they're making knowledge. They're analyzing, evaluating, creating, and in fact, they're sharing it. And when they see your vulnerability of saying, I'm not sure about that, let's learn it together, they understand that what they're discovering is maybe something that's in fact quite unique. Part of this also is their way of making sure that they're intrinsically motivated by saying, I want to do it regardless of the challenge, because the idea of making knowledge is such an important evolution. So how are we going to do this? Now, in workshop number 1, we talked about the backwards design method. So I'm going to touch on it briefly here. But this backwards design method can be used for, say, the overall course. Hey, what should we have when we're done? But it also can be used within each particular module. You start at the beginning and you think about the course planning, the guiding questions, the things that you want in terms of a broader trajectory of the work. You also start at the end. What's the common purpose? What do you think that these courses, when they're done, should reflect? What types of artifacts maybe are necessary? Now, part of this, in order to both start at the beginning and at the end, is that it's important that you have clear learning objectives central to all of the activities and the outcomes. So you see here that when one module ends, you want to try to identify what their outcomes are going to be, what evidence needs to show that, and then you work backwards and figure out what instruction needs to get them there. So this is the backwards design. When you start at the end of the module and say, what should it be? This may be related to specific skills, assessment tasks, learning events. And when you're done, you can actually start to connect the dots. I do have a confession, of course. Sometimes I'm not exactly sure how this process is going to go. And sometimes the project-based learning process defies a step-by-step planning. Sometimes there's a bit of faith involved in saying, if I know how we start and if I know how we end, I'm going to have to adjust the process based on what the students are doing. It still, of course, relates to the learning objectives. And in the essential elements of project-based learning that the Buck Institute or PBL Works has, central to all of it, the reason they have a circle is central to all of it is the learning goals. What's important to learn? How do you understand it? What's successful skills? If you've never written learning goals for a PBL course, you should think about starting with the students will be able to. Add some sort of action or verb with it, and then make sure that you include specific or measurable tasks or other expressions of knowledge. Now, this may help guide you and the students, but it's definitely useful when you're putting together learning objectives for each phase. This helps me, whenever I write these, to plan out what I think the end result wants to be, because I have action verbs, the tasks, and the expressions. In the last lecture, we also talked about the idea of projects having problems inside of them. This is just a different representation of that same idea. You have a project that maybe spans a certain length of time, perhaps the whole semester, perhaps a year. Within that, you want to create smaller projects. And within these smaller projects, or even problems, they then build up the whole. So usually then these are modules, and these modules have a defined deadline and deliverables. They help shift the project forward. So oftentimes you're going to have projects that have these particular deadlines of discovery, ideation, etc. Within each one of those phases, you're going to have projects and problems. The problems then are things that you can easily assess. There's ways of putting together documentation. So when you're done with the end of each phase, what they have to show for it is oftentimes the result of the problems that you've created. When assembled as a whole, all the problems oftentimes make a broader collage. So for example, if you're looking at one of the modules, when you go to that module itself, ask yourself, what are the outcomes and abilities that need to happen with that module? Then what course activities or skills will make that happen? What artifacts? How will they present it? Now, the important part about me demonstrating it this way is that not everyone will have the same type of deliverables. In the larger map of the project-based learning workflow, we saw that from the very beginning, it's intended to have different trajectories that go outward. So in those different trajectories, if you're comfortable with it, make sure that you challenge students to also make choices about what their deliverables will be. Because they have the student voice and choice involved with the process, really lean on that. Really lean on them to be able to understand, like, okay, well, what do you think the right type of artifact would be to be able to prove this particular point about, say, food sustainability? Is it a map? Is it a report? Is it a business plan? Is it a film? Because if you, as an instructor, only have one particular type of outcome, you may get various results where the evidence doesn't really fit with the trajectory that the students have taken. So again, as a recap, the problem-based learning we know is a teacher-defined problem. You're asking them to test the application of knowledge. Now this is, of course, a much more complex thing than just a direct task like, size this beam or solve this formula. That's a direct task in which there's only one right or wrong answer. This is more complex and it can lead to multiple solutions. So ideally, if you think about this as something where they're encouraged to collaborate, they apply their skills and they produce and they defend things, this is a very valid and really interesting way of being able to cultivate a lot of combined skills. Whereas the difference is it might sit within this larger perspective of the project. And in this, as we've talked about, there's different aspects of project-based learning, but mostly that it encourages these different trajectories that go forward. They're still able to apply the skills and knowledge, but it may vary depending on the trajectory that they take. I would simply ask you to embrace this idea that within the somewhat seemingly open-ended aspect of projects, in fact, are very easily quantifiable locations in which you can set up end results, modules, delivery, and assessment. You're a facilitator and a coach to this process, but you're also able to set up the overall schedule and framework upon which this work occurs. So when you go back to the overall map of it, you find out that, semesters have a particular schedule. So you might say, in 2 weeks, we're done with this phase. In 3 weeks, we're done with that. In 5 weeks, we're done with that. And then from there, you work backwards on trying to add in different problems within those different phases. How do you know if you're doing the right thing? Well, oftentimes it takes a certain amount of experience. But there is a rubric for project-based learning, a way of being able to think about whether or not you've done effective project-based learning qualities. In this one, and of course I'll include this in the handouts for the lecture itself, I wanted to show you just what the topics are. What are the learning goals? How's the driving question or problem? Do you actually have an authentic and significant problem? If so, how would you know? Have you made sure there's a student voice and choice? So when you go over to the rubric, you can look at it and make sure that you've addressed these different points within there at the different levels, both the learning goals and etc. Other essential qualities, of course, are the sustained inquiry. The sustained inquiry helps you when you think about the different phases as you scaffold this. It takes you through the different phases of development. The ideation and innovation part of it, this allows you to make sure that there's a creation of artifacts or reports or visualizations. You really want to make sure that there's evidence of the work that's being done throughout. And that evidence then are things that you can assess. Evidence are things that they can produce. It gets us into one of our other topics of the PBL tactics, which is a portfolio. When they're done with the course, they have a portfolio of things that they've actually produced. Evaluation and reiteration. Because they're producing things at regular intervals, you're able to evaluate it, they're able to evaluate it, they're able to present it. Which gets us to our last part, the production and presentation. One of the key ways of developing the soft skills of communication, both written and verbal, is to make sure that you have a regular schedule of public presentations with it. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll work the timeline backwards, knowing then that what the key deadlines are within the semester, and I'll actually schedule outside experts to come in. Or of course we can just have conference calls in which the students might present their work to some of the people that they learned about within the discovery process. This of course takes planning and takes effort. So as you contemplate putting together and scaffolding your project-based learning, it really depends, as you can see, on a lot of variables. The variables of what project you pick, the variables about how long you have, how many students, what different phases of work are comfortable. But I'd like to remind you of something that we talked about already. This could be something that's a 30-minute exercise. This could be a 2-week exercise. This could be a semester long or year long. The idea is that it's a format that works, that's adjustable to be able to let you and your students create a positive learning experience based on the constraints that you have in terms of number of students, semester, etc. The simplicity of this graphic is important to me. The creative process itself is going to work. Now, you're not going to know, or you're not going to be able to anticipate exactly where each student group is going to go with their work. You need to be okay with that. You need to be okay with the skills of being a coach. You need to be okay with someone who says, I think you're on the wrong track. I like your efforts, but maybe you're on the wrong track. Let's help get you back on track. You also just need to be okay not really knowing what you're going to see when you walk into class in a couple days. When you trust this creative process and you stop trying to control the knowledge and you let students participate in how they generate and make this knowledge, what you find is a much different atmosphere within your classrooms. You see students develop a passion for learning. You see them develop the skills that you want them to have, of being critical thinkers, of being engaged within the work. And how that happens is you treat them like the adults that they are, people with vivid world experiences and questions and concerns. And you ask them to invest who they are within the work that they do. So although I've shown you different methods or different phases of project-based learning, different how-tos or prompts, I would say that a lot of this has to do with your relationship with the students and your way of trying to understand what the topic is that you're teaching, so that you know the best way of trying to get the most out of them and the work. But if you trust this creative process, I promise you, you'll get fantastic things. Thanks for watching.